Welcome to the church library. Draw up a chair and join us as we sort through these stacks of old books. I'm Marissa Burt.
And I'm Kelsey McGinnis. And here in the church library, we host conversations about popular Christian books. This season, we are dusting off Christian parenting resources.
Our book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families, examines many of these books, the obscure, the bestsellers, the ones that still pop up in church parenting classes.
Let's see what's on the bookshelves today. Hello, Marissa.
Hello, Kelsey.
And hello, everyone. I'm so excited. We have a guest with us today. We have with us Dr. Camden Morgante. Hello.
Hi, guys. Nice to be here with you.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being with us,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Morgante.
Yes.
Dr. Morgante is the author of the book Recovering from Purity Culture, and we are really excited to talk about this book. There's a surprising amount of common ground between Christian parenting advice and purity culture teaching. So we'll get into all of that. But first, before we kind of get the ball rolling, because once we start talking, we're not going to stop. So I'm going to have Dr. Morgante introduce herself. Hello. Thank you for being with us. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the origins of this book?
Sure. Yeah. You can call me Camden, or Dr. Camden is what I go by online. So I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, have a doctorate in clinical psychology, and I have my own private practice in Knoxville, Tennessee, here where I live. And I'm also a wife and mom of two. And so how this book came about was growing up in purity culture myself as a millennial who grew up in evangelical culture. I really bought into purity culture and all of its, symbols and symbolic trappings, like rings and books and things like that. And really believed in those false promises. And when they didn't happen for me in the way that I thought that they would and the timing that I thought, I felt very disillusioned in my faith. And so out of my personal story, I started kind of questioning purity culture. But then I became a psychologist, started working with clients and seeing how purity culture teachings were affecting them in all sorts of ways that hadn't even affected me in. Just seeing the many different variety of ways it could affect people. And I became more of a critic of purity culture rather than a proponent. And especially being able to kind of tease out the parts of it that felt consistent with my faith and values, and then the parts of it that felt cultural and felt like myths. So, so the book has been a dream of mine for many years. And it was something I was very passionate about and began speaking about online and writing articles about in about 2020. Actually, my first article was written in 2018 about it. And so then all of that has culminated into the publication of this book in October of 24.
Okay. Well, the kind of structure of our show is often around books. It's called In the Church Library. And a lot of the time we're looking at one particular parenting book and sort of picking it apart a little bit. I'm curious, Dr. Camden, what are some of the key texts in the library of purity culture books?
Yeah, I think books were hugely influential for purity culture. I know for me personally, it was the main conduit of purity culture messaging for me. I got some of it at church and youth group. I got some of it from my parents, and certainly they purchased the books and gave them to me, so they supported the message too. But really some of the more insidious myths came from books. And so we can't talk about purity culture without talking about A Kiss Dating Goodbye. That's kind of the classic church library book that really kicked off this purity movement, I think. Joshua Harris was, I believe, about 23 or so when it was published. I'm glad nothing that I wrote at 23 was published, because that would be terrifying.
So thankful.
Yes.
So thankful.
And
what year was that? Do you know off the top of your head around what year was that?
I don't.
Was that late 90s or early 90s or?
I don't. I'm sure we could look it up.
I'm curious. I'm trying to place it. Because I was really
97.
on the very front end, kind of missed it. So when was it?
97.
Okay, so I'm always curious to hear, because I felt like it was kind of in the air, but I didn't live it in the same way. So 97. Okay. And you mark him as kind of the catalyst for what came
Yeah,
after?
I do, because I define purity culture as a socio-political evangelical movement that peaked in the 90s to early 2000s. And so I think he's really what we might call the father of the movement, if a 23-year-old could become a father of a movement. But that's who I think of. And then the many books that followed, the many rallies, there were like purity rallies, purity pledges. There was a rally even in Washington, D.C. And then there were purity balls. So some of the other books that were really influential to me and that I cite in my book and quote, And the Bride Wore White by Dana Gresh was really influential. And then some people will quote like the Luddies, When God Writes Your Love Story. They'll bring up that book, which I was not as familiar with at the time. Of course, Elizabeth Elliot, which predates Joshua Harris, and Passion and Purity, that she could be called maybe the mother of the movement because she had a large influence on it too. I think Every Woman's Battle and kind of that whole series of books was a big contributor to it. And I quote them too. Lady in Waiting, that was my favorite book in high school. And now one that I, quoted in my book as containing purity culture myths. So those are some that I would say off the top of my head were the most prevalent for me.
Yeah. I recognize them all because in the early 2000s, I worked at a Christian bookstore, and like these were all popular books, right? Like the whole Every Woman's Battle, Every Man's Battle, Every Young Man's Battle, Every Young Woman's Battle, all of those, and that it's such familiar ground. And I Kiss Dating Goodbye came out when I was in middle school, and I have very vivid memories of high schoolers in our youth group getting really into that book and kind of like talking about this really kind of radical way of doing Christian dating and courtship. And like, how youth group culture is. It's sort of like when you're not talking about dating, you're like, well, when's someone giving a dating talk? It's sort of like the topic that's like, everyone's fascinated by. And so just hearing all of those titles rattled off just takes me back to that time when I could go to that section of this bookstore and see all those titles next to each other.
Yeah. And have
go ahead.
This one. This is one on my shelf. This is a children's book called The Princess's Kiss by Jenny Bishop and Susan Henson. Did you read this one?
I did not.
This one is like purity culture for
kids,
very young girls to start with. Yeah, start them young. So I think it was even trickling down to there, like in different communities. What is your sense, Dr. Camden, of how frequently these books are still circulating? Like, I know they still have lots of impact on people. Are there still people who are like, this is a great way to go. Let's buy these.
Well, they were hugely best-selling at the time, which you experienced at your Christian bookstore, Kelsey, that you were working at. Like, they were the best sellers. And so they're the kinds of books that sold millions or hundreds of thousands of copies. They're still selling now, except Joshua Harris pulled his books out of circulation because he did regret writing them, and he no longer espouses those beliefs. Yeah, but those authors are still speakers on the concert circuit. They still have ministries based on modesty and courtship and things like that, and teaching those lessons. Or if we look a little broader outside of purity culture, it has a lot of overlap with the biblical womanhood and manhood literature. So you get like Captivating and Wild at Heart and things like that are still pretty popular, and those are still very popular and affluent speakers and authors. So yeah, so it's definitely still around.
Yeah. Gosh. So one thing that we noticed in our research is that in a lot of Christian parenting books, gender and sexuality come up all the time. Like they're something that parents are assumed to be panicking about, whether it's like, oh, like about my young children, like, are my sons sufficiently boyish? Are my daughters sufficiently feminine? All the way up to teenagers, like, how can I keep my teenagers from having sex, right? Like, there are just all kinds of panics. And I wondered if in your research, I wonder what intersections you found between purity culture books and parenting. Like, how intertwined are those things on the other side, like in the purity culture books? Because they're very intertwined in the parenting books.
Yeah, I think a lot of the purity culture books were aimed at young people, so high school teenagers and then young adults like college age. And so they weren't going to talk about parenting since you're assumed not to be a parent yet. But yet they were books that parents were giving their children, as I experienced my parents giving me those books. And they were books that parents felt like they could trust because they provided easy black and white answers and very clear delineation of the rules and the lines and how far is too far and what rules you should follow in order to stay pure or to do the right thing. And it gave parents a sense of like control and this sense of false promises, that you guys also talk about in the parenting literature. But this idea of that, if I teach my kids this, if I give them a purity ring, if they make a purity pledge, then I'm going to be able to protect them and prevent all of these bad consequences from happening because they'll stay pure. So I see the appeal. And in my book, I talk a lot about looking at where these messages came from and developing some compassion sometimes for the people who gave you these beliefs, the pastors or parents that taught these things to you or gave you these books, because they may have had really good intentions. They may have wanted kids to avoid the dangers of early sexual activity. We know that that's realistic, and they may have really wanted kids to learn and teenagers to learn the value of sex and the sacredness of sex. If that's a value that the parents held, that certainly is a valid one to want to pass down to your children. But the methods and the way that it was taught is really what I'm critical of, because there was a lot of shame and fear used as tools of control. It wasn't presenting purity as really an option or a choice. It was coerced and controlled. And there was very little sense of agency or education in order to make a values-informed choice. It was more about these black and white rules that will then guarantee these promises.
Wow. And as you were describing that, I was thinking of when that combines with cultures, family cultures and Christian cultures that presume a parent's authority and kind of expect children to obey right away. Then there's also that additional pressure of, this is a marker of your like faithfulness to God, not just in this relation, not just relationally regarding purity culture, but in your ability to bend into your parents' obvious desires for you. Like that the parents are setting this path for you. Wow, that's complicated. That's a lot for young people to be, fire hosed in without tools that support their agency.
But it's very attractive to be presented with some black and white rules, especially when you are a young person who hasn't fully developed abstract thought and, your brain frontal lobes haven't fully developed yet. And so it's very attractive to think that I can follow the rules and get this guaranteed result. And as I said, like that's something that I bought into, and really the marriage of my faith and this decision to be sexually abstinent, like there was no having one without the other. They were very much like my faith was built on this idol of virginity. And that felt very attractive to me, to be a good girl and to embody like those qualities, and to know that by making the right choices that I was going to guarantee that I wouldn't get my heart broken, and I was going to meet and marry my first love at a young age and like just have a beautiful marriage and life. And when those things, like I said, didn't happen in the timing that I expected them to, I realized how shallow my faith had been and how it was just really built on this, the shallow ground of the prosperity gospel of just, do the right thing and you get these right results. And I think we definitely see that in the parenting literature too, of just if you spank your kids and break their will and things like that and raise them in the way they should go, then you're going to get, great, mature Christian young adults too.
Yeah. And I have memories of being a teenager reading these books and being drawn to kind of the moral high ground, like in the same way that like I think as some parents are drawn to the moral high ground of doing it the biblical way, doing it the right way. As a teen who grew up in evangelicalism, kind of immersed in this, like it's us against the world is going to try to corrupt you, the world is this corrupting force. There was something very appealing about this way of seeing my choices about dating or abstinence as this like righteous cause. And even as and you mentioned sort of the black and white thinking, I think even as a teenager, that was really, it felt empowering at the time. Like it was I was so drawn to that. And looking back now, I find myself not sure how I would have wanted it to go differently, because what kinds of more complicated answers would I have been prepared to deal with? I don't actually know. I mean, you probably have some thoughts on that, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think that when I said like my faith was built on this idol of virginity, like, one of the myths of purity culture that I point out in my book is called the spiritual barometer myth, that your faith and your spiritual maturity is measured by if you're a virgin or not, or how far you've gone, or if you court or don't kiss before you get married and things like that. And so like you, that felt very attractive to me, and that became a point of pride, but not like, a healthy contentment in the choices that I made, but an ugly and sinful pride of judging others and feeling holier than thou kind of. And like you said, it's kind of can feel empowering at the time, but then later on you realize it's not. And that's something that I still see today in the way that purity is talked about by some of the really big name Christian influencers and authors. It's called Purity Culture 2.0 is what it's been, called. It's this repackaging of purity as now female empowerment, kind of co-opting language from the feminist movement of like, this is a countercultural and empowering choice you can make because you know your value and your virtue as a woman, and you're not going to give that away to just anybody. And I can't say that I fully disagree with that. Like there's some parts of it that I'm like, yeah, you do have value and you should respect yourself and make empowering choices. But then there's a flip side of that of like somebody who doesn't make this choice. Does that mean they have less value? Does that mean they're damaged goods, which is another purity culture myth? Yeah, so that's where I think the judgmentalism and pride, I can still see that in the popular authors and influencers that are repackaging these myths today.
Can you say a little bit more about that Purity Culture 2.0? I am so curious. That is not in my algorithm at all. Like I am a married mom with kids, right? Like the algorithm gives me different things, but like what are the messages? What's novel about I mean, you mentioned kind of the co-opting of female empowerment, but like what else has changed? How has this moving now to social media as opposed to books? How has that changed what this looks like?
Yeah, I think it no longer looks like the Duggars, like a family in blue jean skirts and, homeschooled and, just a little bit sheltered looking. It looks like a beautiful influencer who was on a popular dating show on TV and like is now so married and happy and talking about like, how we all need to do this and how, you're more valuable if you do, basically. And it looks like pastors still preaching things like sex is for a man. Like this is the gatekeepers myth of purity culture, that women are the gatekeepers of sexuality. They have to be the ones that set boundaries before marriage, and then they have to be constantly sexually available to meet their husband's sexual needs after marriage. And so when a popular megachurch pastor says the wedding night, that's his night, stand where he tells you to stand, wear what he tells you to wear, do what he tells you to do, that is still the gatekeepers myth. That is still purity culture, where you're telling women that sex is not for you. You're there to serve your husband. And what I think pastors and influencers don't realize, and what I see as a therapist, is the negative repercussions of those messages years down the road, because a lot of my caseload, and I also do coaching online, so I see women and couples, like even in different countries I've seen for my coaching, and what they all have in common, a lot of them did wait for sex, did wait for marriage to have sex, or even waited until they got married to kiss. And 2-3 decades after marriage, they're still struggling with their sex life. Maybe the wife's not able to have an orgasm, or she has low sex drive, in quotes, low sex drive, which really it's from repressing her sexuality because sex is just an obligation to meet for him. And so it has all of these negative repercussions. At its most extreme end, it's fostering rape culture when you say the wedding night is for him and do what he tells you to do. So they present it as a joke in some forms of this Purity Culture 2.0. And yet, I don't know, just as a therapist, I have such a different view of it. Because when I've sat with women who are in sexually abusive marriages, or just, couples who are having sexual problems but love each other, like, it does not feel like a joke at all.
Yeah, that's something we've noted too with speakers or writers. The humor is often a giant red flag, like humor surrounding things that become pain points. Like in Christian parenting teaching, it shows up with spanking and things like this. Like the things the community is kind of laughing about often is covering over something that goes deeper. One thing I really appreciated about your book was how you sprinkled in some examples of people down the road, like you said, kind of living with the reality of this. And I also loved how every chapter closes with some kind of open-ended, really respectful. I noted how you kind of respected people's agency to engage, but suggestions to kind of chart a new way forward. Can you speak to that, how you decided what to include, how you brought your background to that? What, if people are listening, decide to pick up your book, what can they kind of expect in addition to shining light on the problems and untangling them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the book is not a memoir. I really wanted to offer something different because there's been some great memoirs on the harms of purity culture, and it's so important to have those first-person stories. And I do include a little bit of my story or the ways purity culture has affected me in the book. But really, the main focus of the book is on the research, on my clients and their stories, and then on tools for healing. And so I wanted to be able to bring this unique perspective I felt like I had as a millennial who had that personal experience and the personal harm from purity culture, but then a psychologist who knew the research and who knew these evidence-based, therapy techniques that I've been able to apply to my clients with issues with purity culture and sexual shame. And so, yeah, every chapter ends with some of those tools and reflection questions and different things like that for people to really work through it in their own healing. And those are like the best, stories or emails or reviews that I read are people who say like, it took me a long time to get through this book. Like I read it slowly and really took my time and worked through all of the exercises. And, I feel so much more freedom now. And that's just exactly what I wanted for people to be able to do, is to experience some of that healing and that freedom and overcome the shame that's been holding them back so long, and to know that they're not alone, that there is research and all of these stories that I tell that support that other people are dealing with problems from purity culture too.
That's lovely.
Yeah. One common theme in both Christian parenting literature and purity culture is parental authority. In Christian parenting books, I really do think parental authority is like the first principle. And like you mentioned, purity culture books are different because they're marketed to teens, but through parents and through kind of this understanding that your parents are in charge of you. And I wonder how that shows up in purity culture books and even outside of the books and kind of the speaker world around it and the way these books are marketed. Because and it strikes me that there's probably a very gendered aspect of this as well. Because what you were just saying about like this idea that women are the gatekeepers and like, her husband is, her father is first the keeper of her sexuality and then her husband. Whereas no one's saying that about boys and their moms, right? So can you kind of like untangle this web of like purity culture, parenting advice, and parental authority? Like how do those things fit together?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like on one end, we have courtship culture where courtship is defined as your dad guiding and making those like dating decisions for you, or even like an arranged marriage kind of situation, or just really heavily guiding that process, and where it's viewed as you're transferring your authority structure from him to your husband, like you're now under your husband's authority and covering, and your sexuality is kind of guarded by your your father, and then now a gift, for your husband, not for you and him to mutually enjoy. And so that would be one extreme, but I think elsewhere, it's just, this idea that like your parents know what's best for you and you need to follow what they do, or they have the right way and you need to just assimilate to their belief system or their values rather than doing some work to figure out what your beliefs and values are. Yeah, so that's what comes to mind. I lost another thought.
I'm kind of curious, do you have a sense of whether parents were reactionary with their own experiences? You know, because a lot of times when parenting, we see people are drawn to these promises because they are so mythical and aspirational and tap into longings because they don't want to repeat what their childhood experience was. What is your sense of, were parents picking these up because they were like, look, I dated a lot and don't want my kids to have that? Or were they raised in, I don't know, it's maybe impossible to mark that, but what was your sense on that?
Yeah, I think when we look at cultural trends, and there's a chart in the book that kind of charts trends in greater culture and then trends in evangelical Christian culture from the 50s on. And I'm not a historian or anything like that. And so I can't make like, causal implications or anything like that. But just looking at these trends, you're seeing like anytime there was some sort of big change in our culture, like the feminist revolution and birth control and abortion in the 70s, and more women in the workforce, more divorce. And then there was high rates of teen pregnancy in the 80s and the AIDS crisis. Like all of these things are kind of building up to this evangelical overreaction. So then in the 90s, you have purity culture starting as a reaction, I think, to the 80s, 70s and before. And so I think you're onto something with that, Marissa, that probably parents are wanting to go to the other direction, but often we swing the pendulum too far in the other direction rather than trying to find the middle path, because they wanted kids to have a different experience than they did, maybe if they were a part of that sexual revolution or maybe made some mistakes or things that they wish they had done differently. But we just need to be careful not to do that now and swing the pendulum too far in the other direction now, because that is what I fear. And that's sometimes what I feel like I see from other purity culture critics is now we've gone from this ethic of shame, sexual shame, which is purity culture, to this sexual ethic of sex positivity, freedom, liberation, self-expression, and all you need is consent. As long as it's legal and both or all people have provided consent, then it's okay. And I feel like that is also not grounded in one's values. That is still exchanging one prescribed ethic for another without doing the hard work of figuring out what your own values and theological beliefs and ethic are. And so I caution people in my book against that and against exchanging one ethic for another. Without doing that inner work first, because that's empowering to do that inner work and critical thinking to really determine what you believe and to feel like you're making choices that align with those beliefs. That is really the antidote to shame. Sometimes it's promoted that like this sexual liberation is the antidote to shame, just to be shame-free about your sexuality. But the antidote really is to make choices align with our values. And so that first requires us knowing what our values are.
Whew, that'll preach across the board, because that makes me think of the way, too, sometimes it can be people deconstructing from fundamentalism can leap into another kind of fundamentalist thinking because that feels right, even if it's different clothing in that garb. So, yeah, that is really good. I'm going to sit with that for a while. I'm going to when I do the little tile, I'm going to pull from that. I think that's good.
Well, and I think y'all probably see it with parenting too. One of the criticisms of more gentle parenting and the newer parenting approaches is that they're too permissive. Well, they are if you swing the pendulum too far and go in the opposite direction. But if you find a healthy balance, a healthy middle path where you're combining that responsiveness with that structure and boundaries, and it's very healthy and the most research supported parenting style. So it's just a matter of not overreacting. And sometimes I think that's almost like a trauma response, to go in that opposite direction because it feels more safe to do something that feels completely opposite than anything that has hints of what harmed you. So I get that, I have, empathy for that and that urge, I guess, to go in the opposite direction, but really requires doing our work to heal ourselves so that we don't just automatically out of a trauma response go too far in the opposite direction.
Yeah, gosh, that's so good. That is certainly, I mean, we talk about this all the time. We see that with the response to gentle parenting is just this assumption that it's going to be one or the other. It's almost like everyone kind of assumes people are going to be one, they're going to pick one extreme. They're going to either be the most permissive parent in the world or they're going to be authoritarian. And I think people do that about sex too. Like either we convince teens that this is the scariest, worst thing they can do, or they're just gonna accept no rules at all. Like we have to pick one. And in the Christian context, it's always meant we have to be really extreme about this. Like, well, what do we have to lose? Like, it's sort of like the alternative is so terrible. Like, you know, what harm are we really going to do by making it like this super serious, super high stakes thing?
Yeah. I guess to that I say, well, I see the harm. I see the harm every day. Unfortunately, I have clients who did wait and actually regret waiting. And I don't say that to, give people carte blanche to, have premarital sex. I think, again, that needs to be a values-informed decision. But there can be a sense of like, I wish that I hadn't waited because then I still wouldn't be having so much shame, or maybe we wouldn't have these sexual problems that we're having, or I wouldn't have spent so much time repressing my sexuality that I can't even have pleasure in my marriage. Like there is harm in it. There's harm in not following, purity culture and having early sex too, of course. But there's a lot of middle ground in between those two extremes.
So much middle ground. And also but there's also this extreme discomfort, at least within evangelical Christianity, extreme discomfort with different choices, with the idea that there could be different values informed decisions among evangelicals. Could you say a little bit about that? Because I think for a lot of people, that's like a non-starter.
Yes.
Like, what could that possibly mean?
Yeah, and I just see that as black and white thinking. It's all or nothing. It's all good or all bad, all right or all wrong. And I think that something that was very challenging about my book, but also makes it unique, is that I do share that I followed and hold to a sexual ethic of premarital sexual abstinence, yet I leave space for the reader to come to a different conclusion. And even encourage that, like, want them to feel empowered to do that while I'm being upfront and honest about where I come from. And I feel like that is a different take than most Christian authors might take. And, some people will get that, and some people have really appreciated that. Like, like some of the feedback I got from my launch team was like, I've never read a book that said, I'm not going to tell you what to do, and actually done that, not followed through with that claim, I guess. Or I've never read a book that has empowered me to think about what I believe. And then some people don't get that, because I've read reviews that say like, well, I want a stronger take, or, or, I'm not going to read anything by somebody who still believes any part of purity culture, And so it's all or nothing with that too. So yeah. So, yes, there is this fear of anything that goes outside of my belief system must be wrong. And I think being more open to nuance and open to us arriving at different conclusions, but that I respect the process and the work that people do to get there.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. We see snippets of that in different ways in responses from people as well. I'm curious what your sense is of how willing is the broader Christian community to have this conversation. Because sometimes I see like people in churches or still in church leadership dismiss the harm of a number of things or minimize it, particularly if it didn't impact them personally. So maybe older people who were in the parents' role or something, or people who just, it didn't ping their radars. What is your sense? Is this something churches want to gloss over? Are they willing to stop and listen? I know there's in conversation online from people who've survived it. What are ways, maybe I'm thinking of people in pastoral ministry could come engage people with a listening ear? Like, what would you say to those people who it's maybe not impacted them personally? How can they support?
Yeah, it does require a listening ear, as you said, and it requires some humility and some openness and curiosity, um, to just sit with people and to listen to their stories or read their stories online that they share, and to be curious about what their experience was. Like I said, I have clients who've been harmed by purity culture in ways that I wasn't. And what kind of therapist would I would be if I was like, well, that's not real, or that didn't happen to me. It's like, let me hear their story and understand where they're coming from and see how they feel today and what they're suffering with today makes so much sense given what they've gone through, what they've experienced. That's what empathy is being able to see someone's story and understand why they are where they are, even if you don't agree, or even if you didn't experience it the same way or don't see it the same way. So sometimes when people say, well, purity culture didn't harm me, or what's all the big fuss about this? Why are we still talking about it? Or, why is it such a big deal? That kind of thing. I will say, trauma is subjective. And so like two people can be in the same car accident and one can have a trauma response from it and one can, be just fine and kind of move on. And so you may have heard the same purity culture sermon or read the same books and been affected by it in very different ways from your sibling or your friend or, the person you follow on social media. So instead of judging it or criticizing it, being curious and open to hearing about it and really partnering with them on their healing, like being willing to say, like, it didn't affect me that way. Maybe it didn't harm me at all, but I'm willing to listen to you and come alongside you and be a part of your healing and the way that you're trying to seek wholeness, and making sense of this. So that's an encouragement that I give to people. And then I also encourage them to be curious and open about the possibly repressed effects of purity culture in them. That's the therapist in me that wants to dig a little bit deeper when someone's very defensive about, well, this didn't harm me or this isn't bad. Okay, what's really going on there? Like what are you maybe suppressing, or you maybe just don't realize is purity culture? Like, like a Christian man who says, well, my love language is physical touch, so I need to have sex every other day in order to feel loved. That's probably got roots in purity culture, that you have been taught and socialized to believe that sex is the only way to give, or primary way to give and receive love, or you need to meet some sort of arbitrary number of frequency. Or a woman who says, sex is not really for me, it's really for my husband, so I just kind of get it over with to make him happy. That probably has some roots in purity culture too, and you're not seeing the connection. And so those are just some of the common ways that it might show up in someone who might not realize it.
That's helpful.
Can you talk a little bit more? You've mentioned a lot of the like not common problem, but some of the outgrowth you see for some of the down the road of impacts of purity culture in people's lives. And, obviously without getting into like specifics that would violate confidentiality, can you speak to some of the just the big themes in terms of what's downstream of this? We talk about this in our book with bad Christian parenting advice, right? Like what are some, and we have interviews in there for people to tell their stories. Mm-hmm. Here's how this has played out in my relationship with my parents now. Like I can't have a friendship with them now. There are all of these relational, downstream impacts. Mm-hmm. Could you talk about some of the recurring ones that you see?
Yes. I would love to talk about that, and then maybe talk about the overlap between purity culture and parenting effects, because I think there are some more insidious or overlooked ones. But I kind of categorize the main effects in 3 areas: your faith, relationships, and sexuality. And so there's effects in your faith. For some people, this is a form of religious trauma. For some people, it leads them to deconstruct their faith, which may lead to a different conceptualization of their faith, or may lead to them leaving their faith. But for me, it really caused a lot of doubts and anger towards God and disillusionment in my faith. So there was a period of intense struggle and deconstruction, mainly because of purity culture. So that's one area. The relationships piece, it affects you in marriage or in romantic relationships. A lot of people growing up in purity culture don't know how to date because of the courtship practices. And so prolonged unwanted singleness can be a side effect of purity culture. I've had coaching clients in my 40s who've never been on a date, and that's something that they really want. because then you get the marriage culture of the church where everything's pretty centered on the nuclear family and couples, and they feel kind of less than sometimes. So it affects those romantic relationships. It affects platonic relationships between men and women. Like, we can't be friends. We're either, married or nothing. And there can be some fear of that, fear of those interactions. And then our relationship to ourselves, which is maybe where there might be quite a bit of overlap with you guys. So I'll save that to the end. But, and then the third category was sexuality. So I draw a lot from Sheila Ray Gregoire's research here about evangelical women who believe purity culture teachings have lower orgasm rates, higher rates of sexual pain, lower rates of sexual desire, sexual satisfaction, higher rates of sexual shame. I mean, there's a host of sexual problems that can come because of purity culture. And again, some people don't experience those problems, and that's great for them. And they can, be willing to listen and be partners in helping other people find healing. But that's the main, area people seek me out for, is those problems that are showing up in their sexuality. So going back to the problems in relationship to yourself that I think there would be some overlap with you guys is I see a lot of self-doubt and not really having a lot of agency or autonomy, or knowing how to listen to myself, my feelings, my body, my intuition, because I was taught to look outside myself to authority. For them to tell me what to do or what to believe or what to think or feel. Yeah, so there's a lot of self-doubt, especially in women who've just been more disempowered. And that's something that women have to grow in self-trust and being able to listen to themselves and their bodies. And that's so important in sexuality too, to be able to listen to your body and have a relationship with your body. Is that something that you guys would definitely note too?
Yeah. I mean, and I feel like it's a place where we see it in parents, the self-doubt piece. So much untangling what you've learned from Christian parenting teaching involves starting to believe that you could have a good impulse as a parent, that you could have a sense of how to take care of your child. When Christian parenting books, a big part of the project is convincing you that your impulses as a parent are going to be wrong. Your impulse is going to be permissive, to let things slide, to be to give sin a pass, all of these things, and that you shouldn't trust yourself, and that you should teach children not to trust themselves too. So it's both. Everybody involved gets saddled with this real weaponization of the heart is deceitful above all things. You can't trust yourself and your kids can't trust themselves. So here is the biblical way for both of you all the way through, and it leaves parents and children, like you said, looking outside themselves. And it leaves parents looking to teachers and children being told they need to look only to their parents. And it sets up a whole new umbrella of authority, in fact.
Exactly.
It does. And even for a lot of people, when they become parents is when they begin to reframe things. But we hear from a lot of adults who aren't parents navigating the impact as well. So in their frameworks, still these hierarchies, still this there's always been an authority figure diagnosing their heart, telling them what their real impulses are, telling them to dismiss their feelings or that their feelings might be sin or any number of things, charting out this path of behavior. And again, maybe it plays out differently in different families, or as you said, family culture and individual personality and temperament plays into this as well. Siblings may have had different experiences, but we do hear from a number of adults where it impairs their general decision-making ability. They feel paralyzed by decisions, or they feel like their choices are always flawed, no matter what they do, no matter how much time they think of it, or that God is waiting to kind of catch them doing something wrong. So these frameworks that really set up a mindset that says there is only one way, and if you get this wrong, you're going to be in trouble in some fashion. And then when in the real extreme versions of this, when punitive punishment is all wrapped up in ideas about love, there's this sense of any suffering is evidence that I've done something wrong, or if I make a mistake, I need to be punished in some way. And it really sets people up for abusive dynamics in a number of ways or normalizes that kind of thing. So a myriad of problems. It feels like it just can spread in so many ways. But one of the key ones is it really robs children of their agency early on. And there's no off ramp for that. Like the frameworks rarely see that. And so parents are told, instant compliance is godly. This will set your children up for obeying God. And the idea being, once they're on that track, that will carry them. And really what ends up happening is some other person becomes a godlike voice in their life, whether it's parents who are still trying to control adult children who are in their 30s and 40s and 50s, or, maybe a spiritual authority voice from a pulpit or something like that. So it's so unfortunate because it really robs families. I mean, I think we can't know the motivations, but I think about that a lot. And I think for many parents who got on that train, that was not the outcome they were hoping for. They were devout parents who wanted to do things right or not the way they were raised and please God. And the things they have practiced have left them really ill-equipped to reconsider, to listen, to find a different way, because they've practiced these things day in and day out. So it betrays. The language of betrayal, I feel like, has really resonated. It betrays entire families in different ways. And it's so sad because the families are left picking up the pieces and often in a lot of isolation and shame.
Yeah. Yeah. And with the topic of consent, like that's still something I believe in and have started to teach my children, my young children. And I think that goes against this parental authority and immediate compliance kind of teaching, because I'm actually giving them a choice of if they want to hug, or giving them choices as much as possible on, bath and what they wear and things like that. I mean, they still have to take a bath or put on their clothes or things like that, but just whatever choices I can give them, giving them some autonomy with that. Sometimes letting them choose their clothes, even though they're not what I would have picked. So I'm sure that will be throughout the rest of their life with me. So, so I think that relates to what you're saying about parental authority is just, and starts young with teaching them that you have consent and you have agency over your body. And hopefully that lesson will pay off when they're teenagers and they're put into a situation where they feel pressured, or, God forbid, if they're ever in a situation of abuse, that lesson will have paid off. I don't have to do what an adult says. I can question this. I can say no. I can say I'm not comfortable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because some of this is such foolish advice for parents to teach your children never to be able to say no, like downstream of that. That's not a message I think any parent really wants when you play out those scenarios, but they're told early on, no, that's child-centric, to give your child agency. You want to be like, no, it's very important they retain that ability to say yes and no.
And it's not lost on me that in a lot of cases, I think both purity culture and Christian parenting literature tend to take that agency from women more than men. There is this tacit acknowledgement in a lot of these Christian parenting books that they're primarily geared toward moms, because moms are doing the day-to-day parenting, right? And a lot of them will just come out and say, like, moms, your impulse is going to be to be the softie, right? Is to be the softie. And you need to not trust that part of yourself. And similarly, I feel like, it's been a long time since I've read these purity culture books that you're talking about. On the one hand, the gatekeeper thing seems to set women up to be, oh, you have lots of agency, but that seems deceptive. I wonder if you could talk about the ways that purity culture and parenting literature, frankly, both kind of uniquely steal from women, to sort of take their autonomy, because I'm sure there are men who are really harmed by purity culture. I know there are, but it does seem to visit a particular harm on women.
Yeah, even the male authors who write about it will admit that it has a unique harm to women. And yes, I think you're right. I'm trying to remember what you said that I was going to reply to. Remind me what you were saying.
Oh, sorry. It was a very long, rambling question. I do that all the time, actually. It's a bad
Need to
interviewing
take
habit of
notes.
No, so let's see, what did I say? The first
Oh,
part
women.
about
Okay, women. Yes.
women in particular.
So, yes, I see this as all rooted in complementarianism, because it's really this deceptive, like you said, and this faux sense of women, you are in power, you are in charge of the children or of the sexual boundaries or things like that. But really, it's not. I mean, really, it's still you're under your husband's authority, or your sexuality is for him. Your body belongs to him, or you're under the authority of whatever teacher or pastor or author is giving you these parenting or purity teaching. So, yeah, I see it as the way that complementarianism can be deceptive and try to present it as women are just as valuable. Women, have this special and unique role. But it's this, it's really not that. It's really insidious patriarchy and misogyny, I guess. So,
Yeah, and I I think you're right. Marissa wrote the whole chapter on gender and the way that sort of complementarian dynamics play out in families, and
It could have been a whole
even
book. We got so much. It
been a whole
was brutal.
book
It was brutal.
it bleeds into so many. I mean, it bleeds into so many things
Yeah.
in so many ways, and even in parenting books that will sort of say, treat mom as queen is one thing that Marissa talked about. It's almost, it's like a false authority, and it's not an ultimate authority over oneself.
yes,
You're never the ultimate authority over yourself.
And it's always this constant double bind. I think probably with purity culture as well, like for women who are mothers, there's this, you need to be fully absorbed in this, but also don't make it an idol. And it's this very difficult impossibility. Like, you need to care so much about this, but you should also be satisfied if it doesn't work out the way you hoped, because you really have no agency to change that. Like, if you end up in a marriage with someone who isn't godly or treating you well or whatever, like the prescription for you is not respectful of your agency. It is to suffer, that this is God's will, that will somehow be spiritual blessing for you, and any number of other stowaway messages. But I think it comes down to what we were talking about earlier with even children's consent. Like, if you cannot say no, you can never truly say yes. And instead, so many Christian women are told, no, this is really saying yes, but you can never say no, whether it's to sexuality or whether it's to this or whatever your husband wants that you need to submit to. So I think at the heart of it, there's a really distorted anthropology of what it means to be a human being created in God's image, what it means to be a woman and a man, and all of these things. So yeah, it's so deeply entwined with a number of other teaching.
it is.
People just absorb sometimes too.
Yeah. And that's why most of my clients, because of what the work I do, will say that purity culture was one of the most harmful ideologies to them. I'm sure other people would identify others, but I think it's because it's so entwined with gender ideology and power and authority dynamics and body shame. Like, there's just so many other things that it touches that's why I think it makes it so harmful and just overlooked sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and this kind of brings us to kind of what I was hoping would be our closing discussion, which is around the idea of myths, because so much of our ideas about gender are these mythologized archetypes of women as either like, virgin or siren, and like this mythologized masculinity. You mentioned John Eldridge's book, Wild at Heart, at the beginning, and Captivating. To me, those books are like these powerful sources of evangelical mythology of gender. And it strikes me that, Eldridge himself is such a fan of films. Like, every example is like this epic movie. He's so drawn to these mythical masculine figures and these mythical, almost non-existent but beautiful female character. Like, the mythology is so thick. And in your book, you're also drawn to this language of mythology. We use it in our book as well. And it wasn't originally in the title of the book, but it is now. And I'm glad it is, because I think myth really does capture a lot of the beliefs that we develop when we're promised these things according to these promises, right? And I'm just wondering what drew you to the language of mythology, and what are the big archetypal mythologies of purity culture?
Yeah, when I use the language of myth, I'm using that to mean like false belief, not as much like the archetypes. I feel like that's more of an Enneagram 4 way of thinking that maybe I just don't have access to, because I'm more of a thinker. But yeah, I'm meaning it to refer to like false beliefs. And so those were the main categories. The 5 myths that I identified were like the 5 main categories of the false beliefs of purity culture, the false teachings. There could be many more. And then I think there's some like underneath each of them, that kind of go along with it for me. But yeah, I wanted to pull from like cognitive behavioral therapy, which I use and many people have heard from. That therapy is all about identifying your beliefs and changing them in order to make a change in your feelings and emotions, your mood. And so I wanted to draw from that of like, here's the false belief, and what do we want to change it to? What is our new truth that we're going to hold on to? And how is that then going to make a change in our emotional and, behavioral and the choices that we make and how we feel about ourselves? So that's how I was conceptualizing myth. But as far as the archetypes of purity culture, probably like a good girl, and then like, the Jezebel. And then like, the strong masculine man. I don't know if that would be John Wayne, right? From Kristen Kobes-Dumay's work. Yeah, so definitely those archetypes. And then like the archetype of like damaged goods, like that was so symbolic in purity culture, which is why there's a damaged rose on my cover, a damaged and wilting one on my book cover. And then there's one that
image when you know what it means.
Yeah. And then there's one that is, red and new and growing to represent kind of the growth. And like, here's what purity culture told you were, this damaged and wilting and broken rose with missing petals. But here's really how God sees you. Here's really what you are. Here's the healing and growth that's possible. That's what I wanted the cover to represent.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. That's a powerful image. And it's always amazing to me how widespread, how recognized that who wants this rose thing is. Like, it's such a niche thing, but if you are an evangelical of like a certain age, you know exactly what that image is. So it was such a smart cover for your book.
Yeah, thank you. And I could have done other ones. We could have done chewed up gum. We could have
I was going to say that might have.
but that wouldn't have been as pretty on the cover. And it lended itself well to, my book. I had a book release party where we had roses and I wore a red dress and stuff. So it lended itself well to that.
Yeah. Yeah. But better than the chewed up gum.
Right.
I mean, evocative, but also ick.
I'm curious to let people know, where can they find you online? Or if they resonated, are you open to new clients? Are you accepting new clients? Are you working on any projects you want to share? Just a little bit more about where can people connect with you?
Yeah, sure. So you can find me on social media at Dr. Camden, and my website is drcamden.com. I'm open for new coaching clients. And my Substack is called Walking the Middle Path, which is something, that we've alluded to, is like finding that both and between these extremes of either or, black and white. So you can find me on Substack there. And then my book is Recovering from Purity Culture. It's by Baker Books. So you can find it on their website or on Amazon or wherever you buy your books.
Great. And we'll link that in the show notes and to your social media as well. So check that out if you're interested.
Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Camden. This was such a fun conversation.
It was.
We could probably talk for a lot longer. I mean, there's just so much to unpack. But we so appreciate you being with us.
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Here in the church library. Listeners, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
We are so glad you've joined us in the church library today. This is Marissa Franksburt
And Kelsey Kramer McGinnis. And if you liked what you heard here, we think you'll be interested in reading our forthcoming book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting: How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families.
You can pre-order it now wherever books are sold, and it'll be on shelves in October of 2025.